Moed. So in Shulchan Aruch, Orachayim Simin Samach Zayin, the Mechaber Paskins, that if somebody is in doubt, if he read Krias Shema or he didn't, Safek Koreh Krias Shema, Safek Loi Koreh Krias Shema, he's Chayze v'Koreh. That's the halacha that since we paskin that Krias Shema is a doiraisa and Sfeike doiraisa is lechumra, therefore Safek Koreh Krias Shema, Safek Loi Koreh Krias Shema, Chayze v'Koreh. The Mogen Avram brings in the name of the Lechem Chamudois that if he knows that he read the first pasuk, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, even though he's in doubt if he read anything else, Einoi Chayze v'Koreh, because only the first pasuk is a Do'oraisa. Then the Mogen Avram says, V'im mesupik lo im omar parshas tzitzis v'gam emes v'yatziv. If besides for not remembering, if he read V'ahavta and V'hoyoim Shemoya, he also doesn't remember if he said V'yomer and Emes V'yatziv, then according to everyone, he is Choyzer V'koirei. He does have to learn again. And that's the Bach and the Shiltei Giborim, and that's because besides for the issue of Krias Shema Doiraisa, we have another issue of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim Doiraisa. And if you don't know if you said Vayomer and Emes V'yatziv, so you're in doubt if you were Mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, and therefore Choyze v'Koreh. Then the Mogen Avram says, but you know that in the Gemara in Brachas Daf Yud Gimel, it's mevur that if you said a halacha in which Yetzias Mitzrayim is mentioned, you're already yoytze the mitzvah doiraisa of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. V'nireli, therefore, says the Mogen Avram, it would seem to me, the Kol Shekenim Omar Shiras Hayam the Yotza, that if somebody said Shiras Hayam, or the Yotze event Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, because any mention of Yetzias Mitzrayim qualifies for the Kiyum HaMitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, and Mamela Shiras Hayam is Genuk. In other words, the Mogen Avram is saying that the Poskim say, that if you don't know if you said Vayomer and Emes V'yatziv, you have to lane over, is only if you didn't say Shiras Hayam. But typically, a Jew that got up to Krias Shema said Shiras Hayam in Psukei de Zimra, and therefore this Chumrah is not relevant because he was Yoitze, the mitzvah, the Oraisa of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with Shiras Hayam. So in the Hagoyes Chasam Sofer in Shulchan Aruch, he says, I'm not so sure about this kula that the Mogen Avram said that if you said Shiras Hayam, you were Yoitze Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. Mipnei sheloi nizkar bo yoim tzeisenu me'eretz Mitzrayim ki im Krias Yam Suf. In Shiras Hayam, there's no mention of the day of Yetzias Mitzrayim. All we have, just 1 second, excuse me. All we have in the Shiras Hayam is Krias Yam Suf. The Torah requires us to remember the day that we left Mitzrayim. L'man tizkor es yoim tzeitzcha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Elo shechachomim oisifu gam Krias Yam Suf. Mshemhachi odif emes v'yatziv mi parshas tzitzis, because in emes v'yatziv we actually talk about Krias Yam Suf also. Aval Shiras Hayam lechud loy mahani. Shiras Hayam on its own is not enough, says the Mogen Avram, because Shiras Hayam doesn't mention the Yom Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim. It only mentions Krias Yam Suf. V'oid nireli. Besides for that, says the Chasam Sofer, the imloy niskaven lo tzeis yedei choivosoi b'Kriyas Shiras Hayam harei lo yotzo yedei choivosoi the kaimel lo mitzvah strichas kavone. Even if it was true that you could be mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with saying Shiras Hayam, even if that was true, but when one says the Shiras Hayam, Mistama, he's not having kavanah to be mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. We're talking about a yid that is planning on learning Krias Shema and saying and therefore he's not having in mind to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with Shiras Hayam, and therefore he's upset at the Magen Avram that the Magen Avram is saying that if you read the Shiras Hayam, even if you're in doubt, if you said Vayomer Nemes V'Yatzev, you don't have to repeat it because you could rely on the Shiras Hayam that you already said. The Chassam Sofer says there are two problems with this. One is that I'm not sure that Shiras Hayam qualifies for Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim because it doesn't mention the Exodus from Mitzrayim. It's only talking about the Krias Yam Suf. And second of all, even if it does qualify for Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, you have to have in mind to be Mekayim the mitzvah. And typically one is not Mechaven to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with Shiras Hayam. So what can we say about this? So I want to begin with a second question. The second question is, where's the kavanah? We paskin in Shulchan Aruch, Siman Samach, that, I just want to mention, tonight is my mother's yortzeit. I want to dedicate this learning to the schus of Imi Moirossi, Rashke, Etje, Rivke, Bas Reb Chaim Yisro. So the thing is like this. He's asking, we paskin in Siman Samach that mitzvah strichis kavana. Mitzvah strichis kavana. So how could you be Mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim with Shiras Hayam without kavana? So the mice is like this. There's another Magen Avram in Siman Reish Ayin Aleph, in the beginning of Siman Reish Ayin Aleph in Hilchas Kiddush. The Magen Avram says, B'zeh Aloshin, Kosav Rambam Perik Choftes Halacha Vav Kiddush Hayoim Doiraisa Below Yayin. Zocher es Yom HaShabbos Lekadsho is a mitzvah Doiraisa to be Mekadesh es HaShabbos Bidvorim. However, Midoiraisa, it's enough to just say it. Below Yayin, you don't need wine. V'Rabbanon Tiknu Al Yayin and Kiddush B'Mokim Suda, but that's all Midrabbanon. Therefore, says the Magen Avram, "V'nireli de midoiraisa bekiddush she'omer betfilo sagi." That it would seem to me that midoiraisa, you're already mekayim. You say in Ma'ariv of Shabbos, mekadesh haShabbos. That's enough for the doiraisa of kiddush. The krok ksiv zochas yom haShabbos vari zocharoisoi. The kiddush b'mokim suda rabbanon tiknu. So the Mishnah Brura over there in Sif Cotton Aleph says that according to this, if somebody doesn't remember if he did or he didn't make Kiddush al Hayayin, how somebody doesn't remember if he did or didn't make Kiddush al Hayayin, but let's say he doesn't remember. So the Mishnah Brura says, according to the Magen Avram, he doesn't have to make Kiddush again but after davening, the Kiddush is reduced to the level of the Rabbanon because he was already Mekayim the Doiraisa in Tfilah, because the Kiddush Midoiraisa only requires Dvorim, so he was already Mekayim the Kiddush Doiraisa in Tfilah. And what he now has to do is only a Derabanan of Kiddush B'Mokim Suda, and therefore, if he's in doubt if he did or he didn't make Kiddush Al Hayayin, he doesn't have to make Kiddush again. It's only a Sveika Derabanan. The Chei Nafkamina, another Nafkamina, the Cotton Shehigia Lechinuch, Yuchal Lohitziyoi Bekiddush. If the father wants his son to be moitziim with Kiddush, even if the son is still a cotton, as long as he's Higia Lechinuch, the son could be moitzi his father with Kiddush. Because if it was a doiraisa that the father needed to have, so the cotton is considered an Einoi Mechuyev B'Dovar, and he can't be moitzi his father. But since the Magen Avram is saying that the Kiddush Doiraisa you were already Mekayim with Tfilah, and now all you have is the Kiddush D'Rabbanon, so the cotton who's Mechuyev B'Kiddush D'Rabbanon Al Tzchinuch could be moitzi his father, Azoi Zok the Mishnah Brura. But then he says, V'ulam yesh lefakpeik bozeh harbe. True that this is how it comes out according to the Magen Avram. However, says the Mishnah Brura, I'm not so sure about the whole Kiddush of the Magen Avram. The Kaimelon Le'il, Siman Samach, Siv Dalet, the mitzvah strichas kavana, lotzeis ba'asiyas ha-mitzvah. Mitzvah strichas kavana? No. Umistome ein mi derech ha'olam lechaven es hamitzvus asay the zocher es yom haShabbos lekadish betfila kiven sheyesh lo yayin oipaz v'yochel lekadish aleim achakach. Normally, a person davens, he's not having in mind to be mekayim the mitzvah of kiddush because he's planning on making kiddush at home. So there was no kavanas mitzvah. And since we pass in the mitzvah strichis kavana, he wasn't mekayim the mitzvah, even midoiraisa, because he had no kavana. So I say here, once again, we find a Magen Avram that doesn't seem to take into account the fact that we paskin that mitzvahs strichis kavana, just like we saw that with Oz Yosher, he says you will mekayim midoiraisa tzchiris yitzias Mitzrayim, and he doesn't care about the fact that there was no kavana. So also over here by Kiddush, he seems to say that you're mekayim with the davening, even though you had no kavana. And there's a third place where we find the Magen Avram not taking into account the din of mitzvah strichis kavana, and that is in Siman Tov Reish Pei Hey, in Hilchos Megillah. The Magen Avram brings a Tshuvas Trumas Hadeshen that talks about the Bnei HaYishuvim, people that lived in villages. She'ein lohem minyan be'irom, they didn't have a minyan in their village. Ve'hem hoilchim lekehilois hasmuchos lahem liyemei hapurim l'shmeres HaMegillah. They come into town on Purim to hear the Krias Yam Suf. Says the Trumas Hadeshen that Yeroeh, it would seem to me, the Adarabah, Tzorich Tvei sheyishmu parsha zochar b'tzibur mimikra Megillah. These people are making a trip into town. They should make that trip for Shabbos Zocher and not for Purim, because he says Mikra Megillah efshilot says gam beyochid. Mikra Megillah could be mekayim beyochid. Vilu parsha Zocher midoiraisa svirlu hulakamo meharishonim. The boy at tzibur dafke, that there are kamo meharishonim that hold that you need a tzibur for the kriya of parsha Zocher. And the Trumas Hadeshen concludes, Elo sheha'olam loy zehiri bekach. People are not zohir in this. In other words, the Trumas Hadeshen says that it would seem to him that they should come into town for Parsha Zocher and not for Purim, if they only have the option of coming in once, because Parsha Zocher is doiraisa, according to many shittas, be tzibur, whereas the Megillah kibbutz be yochid. So it's a taina on the minig ha'olam. Says the Magen Avram, V'li nire liyashiv. I have a teretz. V'li nire liyashiv minig ha'olam. Ta'otu miksiv b'Torah sheyikru davke b'Shabbos zu. True, it's a doiraisa. Zocher es hash'asa l'cha amolik, but does it say that it has to be done on Shabbos Zocher davke? Maybe once a year. Elo shechachomim tiknu b'Shabbos zu. Chachamim were misakin that it should be on this Shabbos. Hoyelu shchichi rabim b'beis hakneses v'samuch lepurim. It really can be done on a weekday. It doesn't have to be done on a Shabbos. But on Shabbos, people are in shul, and it's samuch lepurim k'dei lismoich ma'isa amolek l'ma'isa hamon k'moish kosav alavush. That's why it was instituted to be mekayim the doiraisa of zocher es hasha'asa l'cha amolek on the Shabbos before Purim. However, v'im came, k'sheshomeya bepurim, parshas vayovo yamolek, nami zoicher ma'isa amolek v'yoytzi lechivosei. So these bnei HaYishuvim that come to town on Purim, they hear not only the Megillah, they hear also the Krias HaTorah. The Krias HaTorah of Purim is vayovo yamolek v'yilochem im Yisrael b'refidim, which also qualifies for Krias Amolek. And true, it's not on Shabbos Zocher, but midoraisa, it doesn't have to be on Shabbos, and it doesn't have to be on Shabbos Zocher. It could be on Purim. And therefore, they kill two birds with one stone. They come and they hear the Krias HaMegillah, and they're also Mekayim Parshas Zocher with hearing Vayove Amalek. So the Mishnah Brura over there says, V'hinei l'mayde kaimelon le'il b'simen samach the mitzvah shrichis kavone yiyet tzorich be'ez shmias parsha zu l'chaven bazeh mitzvah asay shel Zocher. That since we pass in mitzvah shrichis kavone, so if somebody wants to be Yaitze, Zechiras Amolek on Purim with the Kriya of Vayova Amolek, Vayilochem im Yisrael b'refidim, he has to have in mind to be Mekayim the mitzvah. This is what the Mishnah Berurah adds on to the Magen Avraham, but the truth is it's not just an add-on. It really goes against the Magen Avraham, because the Magen Avraham says, I have a way to be miyashiv the minig ha'olam. Now that olam that does what they do, meaning that they come to town on Purim and not on Parshas Zachor, they don't know the Magen Avraham. And they're not having in mind to be mekayim the mitzvah of Zachor with the kriya of Vayovay Amalek. Therefore, it's obvious that the Magen Avraham doesn't care about whether you do or don't have kavanah to be yoitze the mitzvah of Krias Amalek with the parsha of Vayovay Amalek. He's saying that you're yoitze. He's saying that I have a way to be miyashiv the minig oilam. And the oilam doesn't know that you should have in mind. Obviously, the Magen Avraham doesn't care about the fact that you don't have in mind. So we have three places where the Magen Avraham seems to disregard the halacha of mitzvahs tzrichas kavanah. He says that you're mekayim zechiras yitzias mitzrayim with oz yoshir, in spite of the fact that you're not having kavanah to be mekayim the mitzvah zechiras yitzias mitzrayim, you're having in mind to learn Krias Shema say vayomer and emes v'yatziv. He says that you're mekayim the doiraisa of kiddush with tefillah, even though you're having in mind to make kiddush at home and you're not having in mind to be yotzei the mitzvah of kiddush with tefillah. And he says that if you hear Vayovay Amalek in Shul, on Purim, you're mekayim the mitzvah of Zchiras Amalek, in spite of the fact that you're not having in mind to be mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. So it would seem that the Magen Avraham holds that in the mitzvahs of Zechira, the principle of mitzvahs Shrichas Kavanah does not apply. Now, why is that? All these three are mitzvahs of Zechira. It's Zchiras Amalek, Zchiras Zochar Yom HaShabbos L'Kadishoy, and Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim. But why should we say that mitzvahs of Zechira don't require Kavanah? So, the mitzvahs of Zechira, the Gemara says in Megillah, maybe it just means to remember. To remember, meaning Zochar is Zechira Belev. The Gemara says no, that Zechira means Bepeh. Because it says Leisishkach, Hari Shichichas Halev Omur, Homani Mekayim Zochar. Zochar is Bepeh. So, in other words, Zochar really means remember. But we say that Zochar means mention. Mention the Yom HaShabbos L'Kadshoy. Mention Amalek. Mention Yitzias Mitzrayim. But the question is the mitzvah to mention, or the mitzvah is really to remember? And the mentioning is a hechetimtze, to ensure that you remember, so the Torah is mechayiv you to verbalize that thought in order that it should be remembered. But the mitzvah is not the mentioning per se. The mitzvah is the remembering that's brought about through the mentioning. Oh, so, if we say the latter, in other words, if we say that the mitzvah really is the remembering and the mentioning is in order to preserve the memory, then we have a way to understand why the principle of mitzvah shrichas kavanah does not apply. And that's based on what Reb Chaim said. It's brought in the stencil of Reb Chaim, and it's also mentioned by Reb Elchanan Wasserman in the second chelik of the Kovetz Shiurim. Reb Chaim said that mitzvah shrichas kavanah only applies in mitzvahs where the act in itself is the mitzvah. But where in mitzvahs where the consequence is the mitzvah, we don't say mitzvah shrichas kavanah. Reb Elchanan says it in this lashon: V'hinei matzinu shnei sugei mitzvahs. We find two types of mitzvahs. Achas she'asiyas ha'maisa al yedei ha'adam hi guf ha'mitzvah k'goyin shofar v'lulav. It's the act of blowing shofar. It's the act of shaking the lulav. It's the act of eating the matzah. That in itself is the mitzvah. Beis, there's another type of mitzvah. She'ikar ha'mitzvah hi toitzoas ha'maisa. The ikar is the consequence. K'goyin pidyon shvuyim. Krias Balchoiv. I mean, imagine somebody paid his Balchoiv, but he didn't have in mind to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Krias Balchoiv mitzvah. You think he has to pay him again? Says Reb Chaim that in a mitzvah where the consequence is the mitzvah, and the act is only in order that the consequence should be attributed to you. I mean, you have to do it. But really what we're looking for is not the act, but the fact that is brought about through the act. So then we don't say mitzvah tzrichas kavana, pidyon shvuyim, priyas balchoiv, pirya verivya, v'chulei. V'achilik v'anafkemina bezel lekamo dvorim, kigoin, Laman doma mitzvah tzrichas kavana, tekel or shir, tzarech lachzav l'itkoya. If you blew shofar without kavana, you have to blow again. We come up with priyas balchoiv mitzvah, in Torah shaloi b'kavanas mitzvah, lo yinoim asher tzarech lachzav l'froya. V'chein b'mitzvah pirya verivya, sha'mitzvah shiyu loy bonim, v'ariyesh loy bonim. That's the lashon of Reb Elchanan in the name of Reb Chaim. The emes, this has to do with the sugya in Rosh Hashanah, the sugya of mitzvah tzrichas kavana. You see from that sugya that the kavana is not something that we need in order to, that the gavra should have the mitzvah. But we need the kavanah in order that the maisa be defined as a maisa mitzvah. How do we see that? Because we see that mitzvah tzrichas kavanah is relevant legabe bal tosef. Lamandam a mitzvah tzrichas kavanah, one is only over bal tosef if he had kavanah's mitzvah. Now, to be over bal tosef, you're not being mekayim a mitzvah b'chlal. So it's not. If we would say that the need for kavanah is in order that the mitzvah should be oile for the gavra that's mekayim the mitzvah, then mitzvah tzrichas kavanah would not apply to the aveira of bal tosef, that you should only be over bal tosef if you had kavanah's mitzvah. Obviously, an act of mitzvah without kavanah's mitzvah is not considered a ma'aseh mitzvah, and therefore, gabi bal tosef also. If you didn't have kavanas mitzvah, so you didn't do the ma'aseh mitzvah, so there's no bal tosef. Meaning that in order to be mekayim mitzvahs, that the ma'aseh itself is the mitzvah, you have to establish the act as a mitzvah act, and it can't be a secular act. It has to be a mitzvah act. And how does it become a mitzvah act? Through kavanas mitzvah. But when we're talking about mitzvahs where the consequence is the mitzvah, like Krias Balchoiv L'Moshel, the act is only a medium. It's only in order that the consequence should be attributable to the oiseh. So the act could be a secular act. The act doesn't have to take on mitzvah quality. And therefore, mitzvah tzrichas kavanah doesn't apply in such mitzvahs. And the Mela, I want to say that the Magen Avraham holds that in mitzvahs of schira, there's no mitzvah tzrichas kavanah, because mitzvahs of schira are mitzvahs where the consequence is the mitzvah. The remembering, the verbalizing of that memory is just in order to ensure that it's remembered, that Amalek is remembered, that Yetzias Mitzrayim is remembered, that Shabbos is remembered. And since the mitzvah is not in the act per se, like in the Tilas Lulav, but the mitzvah is in the consequence, therefore the principle of mitzvah tzrichas kavanah doesn't apply. And therefore the Magen Avraham says that if you daven, you mekayim the mitzvah of Zachas Yom HaShabbos L'Kadishoy. If you heard Vayovay Amalek and Purim, you will mekayim the mitzvah of Schiras Amalek. And if you said Oz Yosher, you will mekayim the mitzvah. You will mekayim the mitzvah of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, in spite of the fact that you didn't have Kavanas mitzvah, because this is compared to a mitzvah like Pirya Verivya, like Priyas Balchoiv, mitzvahs where the Toitzoas HaMaisa is the mitzvah and not the Maisa in itself. Now, if this is true, maybe we can also answer the first question of the Chassam Sofer, which is that L'chori Yetzias Mitzrayim is to remember the day Zocher es Yom Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim. L'man Tizkor es Yom Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Avada, and he's saying that in Oz Yoshir, we only talk about Krias Yam Suf, we're not talking about the Yom Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim. So it could be that avada, if the mitzvah would be the talking per se, then the talk would have to be a talk about the Yom Tzescha in itself. But if the talking is only in order to bring about the memory, it could be that it's enough to talk about Krias Yam Suf in order that the memory of Yetzias Mitzrayim be kept alive, because what, after all, is Krias Yam Suf about? I mean, Krias Yam Suf is really the completion of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the Yom Tzescha Me'eretz Mitzrayim is remembered, even though in terms of mentioning, I didn't explicitly mention it's the Yom Tzescha, and I only mentioned the Krias Yam Suf, but nevertheless, it does suffice. But I think that both hasagas of the Chassam Sofer on the Magen Avraham are both based on the same idea, that the Chassam Sofer holds that the mitzvah of Schiris Yetzias Mitzrayim is to verbalize Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the mentioning. That's the Gufa mitzvah. If the mentioning is the Gufa mitzvah, you have to explicitly mention the Yom Tzescha, and you also have to have kavanah, like in all mitzvahs, that mitzvah is kavanah. But if the Magen Avraham holds that the mentioning is only in order to ensure the remembering, therefore it could be that it's enough to say Oz Yosher, and it's enough that to say it even if you didn't have kavanah, because it's the accomplishment that's the mitzvah and not the act in itself. You know, in the Reb Kiva Eger, in his Agos, in Siman Samach Zayin, he says, Chasni, my son-in-law Hagoin, my Reb Moshe Sofer ner your Avdak Preshborg, b'tshuvosoi, b'chulei hisig al zeh, that the Chassam Sofer went against the Magen Avraham, the Rachmone Kopid Laman Tizkor es Yom Tzescha, v'lo Yom Krias Yam Suf. Ulani is daiti, says Reb Kiva Eger, Torah's emes befiv, Shel Moshe, that this is emes of Torah's Moshe, says the father-in-law about the son-in-law, that the Chassam Sofer got it right in his argument against the Magen Avraham. Ani is daiti Torah's emes befiv Shel Moshe, the lahedya issa b'medrash, there's a mafurish medrash in Shmois Rabbah, in Parshas B'Shalach. It says, Shonu Rabbi Seinu, HaKoirei Hashma, Tzorich lahazkir Krias Yam Suf u'makas b'chorim be'emes v'yatz. That one lane Shema, he also needs to be mazkir Krias Yam Suf and makas b'chorim be'emes v'yatz. Ve'im lo hizkir ein machzir noise. However, this is not le'ikuva. If he didn't mention Krias Yam Suf and makas b'chorim, ein machzir noise. Avol im lo hizkir Yetzias Mitzrayim machzir noise. Shenemel man tizkir Yom Tzescha me'eretz Mitzrayim. So you see, Reb Kiva Eger understood that this medrash that says, Avo im loy hizkir Yetzias Mitzrayim machzir noisoi, is talking about somebody who mentioned Krias Yam Suf u'makas b'chorim. And Mamela, he's proving that the Chassam Sofer is right, that without mentioning Yetzias Mitzrayim, without mentioning Yetzias Mitzrayim, that you can't be Yoitze with Krias Yam Suf. But you know, the medrash really doesn't have to be read that way. It says like this: Tzorich lahaske Krias Yam Suf u'makas b'chorim be'emes v'yatz. Ve'im lo hizkir ein machzir noisei. Aval im lo hizkir Yetzias Mitzrayim machzir noisei doesn't have to mean that this lo hizkir Yetzias Mitzrayim is talking about somebody that was maskir the makas b'chorim and the Krias Yam Suf. It could be that these are two different statements. One is that if you missed the added on Krias Yam Suf u'makas b'chorim ein machzir noisei. However, if you missed the Yetzias Mitzrayim machzir noisei, but this person that missed the Yetzias Mitzrayim is not the person that said Krias Yam Suf and makas b'chorim. Obviously, that's how the Magen Avraham would learn this medrash. In any case, the thing is like this. This is l'chora akula. This is l'chora akula that was saying that mitzvah, according to the Magen Avraham, mitzvah ain't shlichus kavana in mitzvahs of remembering, because the act is not the mitzvah, but the consequence is the mitzvah. But it's a kula in the halacha of mitzvah shlichus kavana, but it's a tremendous chumrah in the essence of the mitzvah. because it means that a Jew is expected not to talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim, not to talk about Amalek, and not to talk about Shabbos, but actually to remember, to internalize. And it's just, the talking is just a way to bring about the remembering, but the tachlis is really the remembering. Now remembering Yetzias Mitzrayim. I mean, Klal Yisrael is a people of memory. You know, every day. I mean, we start off in the morning. I mean, with Zera Avram, Zera Yitzchak Yechida Sheneket Al Gabi HaMizbeach, Adas Yaakov Bincha B'Charecha. I mean, the whole davening of Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu v'Elokei Avram v'Elokei Yitzchak v'Elokei Yaakov and Yetzias Mitzrayim, and we go from Yetzias Mitzrayim. I mean, we really say Atahu Ad Sheloi Nivra Ha'olam, Atahu Misha Nivra Ha'olam. I mean, we go back to before Brias Olam, and we say Baruch Mechaya Mesim. We go all the way to the end of days. I mean, to say so. I mean, but we do so much of this that sometimes, you know, we don't even get it. It's, you know, like the guy that said he learned Gans Masechtas Erevin, but they were just, and he learned it quite well. But there were two Rashi Tevesin that he didn't get: Reish Hey Yud and Reish Hey Reish. Yeah, Rishus HaYochid and Rishus HaRabbi. So I mean, sometimes you can go through all the texts and you don't even you miss the main point. Yes, so I'm saying we can talk the talk, but do we really internalize the ideas? Does it become part of who we are? I mean, so that's really a challenge. You know, it says really in Shulchan Aruch that the Magen Avraham brings, the Mishnah Berurah brings, in the name of the Zohar in Siman Nun Aleph, in Orach Chaim, that every day when a Yid says Oz Yosher, Yedame Bedaitoi Ki'ilu Boy Bayoim Over Esayam. A person should imagine, should visualize, should feel as if today he crossed the Yam Suf. I mean, how could we be expected every day to consider it as if today we crossed the Yam Suf? But that's really the idea of internalizing the memory. What is that supposed to, but how are we supposed to do that? Mistama the Pshat is, because, you know, the Gemara says that Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah says, Koshin mizoinoisov shaladum ke Krias Yam Suf. Yeah, to make a living is as difficult as Krias Yam Suf. You know, usually we think, I mean, most people that say that are the people that can't make a living. They say, oh, it's so difficult. But, you know, the Baal HaMemre is Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah. Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, Daf Nun Daled, that he had 12,000 agolim of Maisa Behema every year. In other words, so he was a very rich man. The Gemara says in Brachos that somebody sees Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah in his dream, Yitzapel Ashirs. More people see money in their dreams than they see Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah. We don't even know what Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah looked like, but this is what the Gemara says. Haroya Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah b'chaloim Yitzapel Ashiris. So Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah was the symbol of Ashiris, and he's the Baal HaMemre Koshin mizoinoisov shaladam ke Krias Yam Suf. So obviously, this is not something that he said with a krecht oivei. It's so difficult to put bread on the table, but he was saying. And what does it mean, koshin? I mean, the Rebbeinu Shalom was a koil yochel. I mean, is something difficult for him? But the pshat is like this. He's saying, when somebody's successful, so he has a tendency to take credit for his accomplishments. You know, when do people say, it's bashet? When something goes big, they say, oh, it's bashet, what could you do? When somebody does a great deal, he doesn't say, oh, it's bashet. He says, wow, that was really a shrewd move. Yes, so Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, who was so successful, he said, I recognize that Kosher is a nice Shalom ke Krias Yam Suf, and just like nobody took credit for Krias Yam Suf, yeah, even somebody who had a great sense of self, I mean, it didn't say that I split the sea. Yes, everybody recognized that it's Zek Keli Van Veu, Elokei Avi V'Aroi Memenu. Everybody recognized that it was the Yad HaGdolah She'osa Hashem. So Mamela, I recognize, in spite of my great success, that has nothing to do with me. In other words, I recognize that Koshin mizoinoisov shaladam ke Krias Yam Suf, and it's Hashem's doing, and that's the statement. So Mamela, every person has to realize, has to try to realize by verbalizing it over and over again, we'll try to take in this idea that really there's no difference between Krias Yam Suf and making it through the day. Because like the Ramban says in the end of Parshas Boy, that mitoich hanisim hagloyim, or ha'adam makir, in the nisim nistarim that he has every day. In other words, the tachlis of the nisim hagloyim, of the open miracles, is to make a person aware of the divine presence in this world, and that everything is the Yad Hashem. And the Mela, a person taka can live in a way that he's kikilu boy by yom v'sayam. I mean, that every day is a chesed Elokim, and nothing should be taken for granted. Nothing should be taken for granted. The truth of the matter is, only somebody that doesn't take things for granted enjoys life. Because if you take things for granted, so the pshat is you have expectations. You have expectations. Normally, your expectations are beyond what you actually get. So Mamela, you're always focused on what you don't have, not on what you do have. Whereas if you have no expectations, because you know that you really don't deserve anything, and it's all the chesed Hashem, so then it's Zeh Hayoim Oso Hashem. No, you live in this boy. Listen, every day is a day to celebrate because every day is a chiddush, because we know that life is not a default position. The default position is death. And every moment of life is a chiddush. Al kol neshima uneshima tahalal ko. Now, if besides for life, you also have a little bit of health. You also have a little bit of wealth. Is the chavada tahalal ko. Is the chavada everything is like Krias Yam Suf, and Memela, that's the idea that we should take l'chayra out of Shvi Shel Pesach when we celebrate Krias Yam Suf, that we should know that Krias Yam Suf is something that happens every day in our life. Und das ist das Rabbi Yosef.